To start off, we have all heard this quote before, and it's it's very it's used all over the place. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, by William Gibson. This quote is super relevant in a lot of ways when you start talking about technology. To me, it was incredibly relevant as a student, and especially true in the 1990s at MIT at the Media Lab, as Philip mentioned, and also as a researcher at Xerox PARC. It felt like we were able to access the future. At the time, we were playing with all the toys, right? We had the wearables and desktop manufacturing and microcontrollers and all of these things that would only much later, and now we think about and are becoming commonplace. Still not fully distributed, and of course, questions of equity and questions of distribution and politics. But this whole idea that a technology that is being invented and played with and toyed with can be accessed really struck me because I was seeing amazing things that were being done. I started to see magical experiences in labs and in places like Ars Electronica, places like SIGGRAPH conferences, symposia like this one. People were talking about things that I had never seen before and that were only possible through this technology. But what started to really bother me was that it wasn't accessible. It wasn't possible for most of the people to experience this. So it's at that point, about 20 years ago now, that I started a company, started a design firm, essentially to try to create interactive installations for public spaces. We ended up doing, with my partner, Susan L.K. Gorbet, and also collaborating often with my brother, Rob Gorbet. We started creating experiences for places like retail spaces, festivals, hospitality, and art commissions. And the interesting thing is, at that time, when we would talk to people and say we were doing interactive installations, we would typically just be met with a blank stare. People did not know what to make of the idea of an interactive installation. Now, of course, flash forward, and we see interactive installation has become a thing. The future, in some sense, has arrived. And what that means is it's a space that has matured, it has caught up, things have shifted, and we're seeing commercial work. We're seeing people installing these kinds of reactive, interactive, behavioral spaces all over the place in museums, galleries, events, and sometimes even part of architectural spaces. People are learning to bring environments to life. So to echo some of what Philip was saying, for the past couple of years, I have been working on this kind of thing in terms of bringing environments to life in the context of the Living Architecture Systems Group. And some of the people who are also presenting today are colleagues of mine who I work with and work with every day. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more broadly, but one of the pieces, for example, that you saw a photo of already, and I think we'll see a lot more of, is this one, Meander, which is just steps away from the University of Waterloo Architecture School hosting this symposium today. So the thing is that these spaces and the spaces that they're being created, they started to emerge, and there was something that was always feeling a little strange to me. The thing is that as we are putting responsive behavior into physical objects, there's one industry that I felt should be able to integrate this kind of technology into what they do. An industry that thrives on innovative form, materials, expressive functional products, and an industry that is concerned with how people feel in their environment. And that is the furniture industry or the furnishings industry, and specifically the high-end, designer furniture, right? Why is it that we see so much attention paid to materials, to form, to color, and we don't actually see code, behavior, interaction? We don't see that kind of stuff being talked about, being described. That's not part of the palette, or hasn't been. And the question is, why? Why don't we see this kind of responsiveness from the objects that we cherish and the objects that we surround ourselves with? Why can't we bring things in our environments to life? And of course, when I say that to people, they usually look at me with shock and horror, and they say, I don't want my carpet to be reacting to me, thank you. I don't want my walls, or let's leave that stuff alone. Sorcerer's Apprentice comes to mind. And that may be true, and that's a very valid point. And that is actually, given the way most of our intersections with technology go these days, that is something to really be thinking through, and it's definitely at the core of a lot of this. There's something a little bit more, though, which is, if you're thinking that, you might also be thinking this, if I can start to imagine an object or an environment that is doing something or that is reacting, The question, of course, is what is it going to do? What would that thing do? What will it do in my world? And the answer is that my answer is that depends. It doesn't do something. It's a bit like asking what color is it going to be, or what will it be made of? You know, the idea that I'd like to talk about today is that behavior in the objects around us can be separated from this idea of a specific task-based functionality. Behavior is simply another axis of design that I'd like to talk about how we can apply that to the objects that surround us. Now, this may be a little bit all abstract at this point. I have a few examples to show, just to start to explore this space a little with you. This piece by Naoto Fukusawa in collaboration with IDEO. This was done in 2001. It's called A Chair with a Soul Left Behind. And this piece is exploring this idea of personalization of objects and the artifacts around us. So people sitting in the chair can interact with the space and each other. As they get up to leave, it preserves, as part of its physical design, one aspect of you, which is this close-up macro of your clothing. He's referring to how, you know, you'll walk into a room and you'll see all kinds of chairs arrayed around tables, and people will go and they will put their jacket over the table or over the back of the chair, and that will become their chair. So what is it for an object to absorb some of us or to reflect some of us like that? This piece, jumped forward, I think. There's a piece is called Claude Glass, and it's by John Stamm. This is essentially a mirror. It's a very large sculptural object in an environment in which you can see yourself and your environment reflected. At the same time, and this is inspired by something called the Claude Glass, which was a Victorian artifact that people would keep, these polished glass stones, to look at themselves and to look at the environments around them in ways that were more discreet, perhaps, than was socially acceptable if you wanted to be staring or looking at other objects. Very interesting social dynamic there. So this is Claude Glass blown up and incorporated with technology. Over the course of the day, very, very slowly and very, very subtly, there is imagery that appears on the Claude Glass, and it's a time-lapse image taken of an environment, and there's several different environments possible or available. Simultaneously, if you reach up and you turn the entire piece, which you can then reach in and control the time of what's happening in the Claude Glass. So it's a piece of furnishing, it has a function, but it is also this poetic expressive object in your environment. There's a table created by a firm in 2013 called Rock, Paper, Robot, and it's called the float table. This table is just made of cubes of wood that seem to and actually do levitate. So they all sit connected to one another, but simply levitating and holding on. In this sense, it's active, it's interactive, it's reactive. It responds to impulses and input that people give to it, and it elucidates and it illustrates natural forces. So Rock, Paper, Robot created this table, and they created a few other pieces of interactive furnishings like this. We explored a table project as well in 2008. This is a table with a secret. It's called the Maid Table, and it's done in this very very modernist, kind of very blank, very empty style, with the idea being that as one approaches or as one intersects with the table, as one interacts with the table, you start to see the secret that it holds. If you put anything on the table, including your hands or anything else, then you start to see some ornamentation come through. You start to see some details emerge that disappear, that are not there if there's no one in the space, that are not there if you're not there. And those details actually carry with them a secret. They're built as a Victorian doily pattern, but they include within them iconography and objects that tell a story that can be found if you look hard enough for them, as in the picture on the right. Along with the table, there was also a set of wall panels which were responsive, and the wall panels complemented the table in their showing of themselves, in their expressing themselves when one walks by them or approaches them. And then if people are gone, they disappear. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I talk about behavior. It's tough to know when you have something that has behavior, how it's going to feel to own or to use it, to be in its presence, to work with it. And it's really tough to know when you think about furniture or objects that people love and desire and surround themselves with and pass on to their children and heirlooms. how does this kind of work fit in with that? How does it fit in with commercial production? How does it fit in with existing systems in the world? And it's been literally 2 decades since Naoto's chair, the chair with the soul left behind, and why don't we have such things? Why do such things not exist in our spaces? There is an answer to this, and the answer is there are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons. It's a constellation of reasons. Can be, maybe separated out or presented as three categories: the human, the technology, and the business. And within those, and the way they all intersect as technology develops and as people do these kinds of explorations, things sometimes align, they sometimes come together. There are many, many, many things on this chart, and each one of them could be an hour-long discussion. So we're not going to go through all of this today or here, but it's important to understand that they're all important. And there's just one that I want to highlight before I go on. Up in the corner here, up there, it says smart home. And I think there's often a confusion when you start talking about interactive furniture or reactive furniture or active furnishings, behavior in objects. People immediately think of Alexa or the Nest thermostat or these kinds of things. Those are really interesting and they're very important. And they're also an emerging piece of the future that is coming to live with us. And they also have behaviors intrinsic to them. In this discussion, I want to separate from that because those really are their own devices. They have their own functionality and they're doing a thing. Those are information appliances. And what I'm talking about here is something very different. I'm talking about a thing that has as part of its design behavior and is active or responsive, but that's not its function. So I want to focus on this word function, and I want to talk a bit about function. What does it mean for an object to have a function? And if you, the original question we had before looking at those examples is, what does it do? Another question is, how do I use it? How do I use this thing? And the thing is, this is a bit of a framing question. How do I use it and what does it do? Put you in the mindset of how am I going to operate this device? How am I going to, what does it expect from me? And really, if you're talking about a chair is a thing that you sit on. That's how you use it. And that's what you do. And it's not a chair if you can't sit on it. There's a quote from Carl de Silva. If a product did not allow sitting, it would not be considered a chair. He goes on. I mean, that's kind of fundamental if you're going to be designing products. So this question of it already has a function. The behavior is not necessarily the function. The behavior is simply an aspect of the design. It has a purpose, the behavior, and there are qualities to it that we'll discuss. But it's a little bit by analogy, speaking of non-human participants, about talking about like, what is the function of a cat? What is the function of a house pet? What does it do? How do I use it, right? It's not about that. It's all about how does it make me feel? What does it do for me? What does it change the way I think about myself to have this part of my environment have an animal in it, right? A pet or a non-human occupant of my own home or my space. Do we consider a pet to be furniture? Sometimes, maybe. Is this an interactive table? Maybe. Do we consider a pet to be furniture? Well, sometimes. Sometimes an aquarium is furniture. What about a houseplant? Do we consider it a pet? Is it furniture? Does it have behavior? Maybe at some time scales, maybe in some stimuli, you can say that a houseplant is behaving or has behavior, has ways of responding, reacting to people. So this is a continuum. But it's important to say that this purpose is more ephemeral than the functionality of, say, Alexa. It's more actually about us. It's more about the person in the space. So back to the cat for a minute. This piece by Peter Stathis is a piece of industrial design. It's a sort of a seminal work from the Cranbrook Academy, 1988. At that time, there was a lot of form making of objects that was very, very representational, attempting in a way to essentially illustrate the meaning of an object through its form. Not necessarily the function, but the meaning as well. And this particular piece is a tiny little television that was at the time made to sit by your bedside. Unheard of, right? have a screen in your bed or next. Why would you know? Nobody does. Well, flash forward 20 years. Actually, we do have our companion screens that we go to bed with. This particular one was designed to be a companion. It actually it's made to evoke the form of an animal or a cat, and it has a specific behavior. In addition to being a television, when you touch it, it turns its head and looks at you. It's expressing that it is your companion. It is expressing that it is going to be there with you for the next little while as you watch your scheduled TV show in days before Netflix. But this piece illustrates something about objects with behavior. Let me show another one. This is current, and this is available now. You can go and buy and install in your space active stair lighting. So the active stair lighting follows you as you go up the stairs, follows you as you go down the stairs. It exists in your space. And if you look at how this is presented to the public, how it's sold and what it's doing, it isn't, of course, there's a safety issue, right? I mean, you can't go down a dark staircase. What if you trip, etc. And that's all true, very true and important. But there's something about what we're seeing here that is really quite special. As this person walks up and down the stairs know she is there. And they express that they know she is there by lighting up and helping her, following her path. And the key here is that this behavior is doing something for the person who is experiencing the space. It's helping them feel seen, helping them recognize that they matter. And this is a basic human thing. There is a part of our brain, to bring back in the phenomenology, there's a part of our brain that will process things before we actually process things. But when you have an experience like this, or an experience like the table where you run your hand along it, or an experience like where you walk up to an object and it wakes and looks towards you, there's a fundamental human response to that, which is positive. And we can design behaviors across the spectrum. We can design behaviors that play with that, both positively and negatively. But when we talk about adding and imbuing objects with behavior, we're really talking about it at that level. What do I get from this object that tells me what it thinks of me? And it's a bit complex, but we can unwind the Gordian knot of that another time. I want to show two other quick projects just to give a little bit of a bookend. We talked about objects that have behavior. We talked about objects that are active. So this is another piece by Rock Paper Robot from years ago called a Robotic Chandelier, and it is essentially a robotic chandelier. It's exactly that. Now, it can expand and it can get smaller, and it can do so in response to what's happening in the room. If there's a lot going on, if there's a lot of activity, it gets bigger, it takes up more space, it gets brighter, and if it's more cozy, it gets smaller, and it does that. While we're on the subject of robotic lighting, I now want to turn to this one, which is by Guy Hoffman and colleagues at the MIT Media Lab, now from 2007. He was inspired by Pixar. You're not looking at his piece, of course, you're looking at his inspiration. We all know this expressive Luxo lamp and just how expressive these inanimate objects can be. This inspired Guy as he went to the Media Lab. He had been a character animator, and he went to the MIT Media Lab and he developed this lamp, which in the robotics group, which would actually have movement that really started to help you feel that it was alive, embodied. The lamp, it did things that other robotic lamps and other robotic tools had done before, but the way in which it moved is really what he's experimenting with here. And it's evoking the companion. It's evoking the interested, supportive, non-human collaborator. And that's done just through its motion, just through the movement, the choice made. Humans are amazingly good at picking up these cues. And so starting to design with this in mind, one starts to be able to wrap all of this up. Now, the real difference here, and one interesting thing to me, is when you look at those two robotic lamps, if I put them at this end of a spectrum, those are active, they have behavior, they're in our environment. They're technology, they're robotic, and they seem to have a certain amount of agency. They themselves are actors in our environment. On the other side of the spectrum of things we've seen, there's the plants, the aquarium. They are, for lack of a better word, and there probably is a much better word, they're decorative. They're decor in our space. They're not something that that really even enters our mindset other than by framing and creating a space. And of course, a lot was said about this earlier today in terms of phenomenology and how we create the warmth, etc. It's the space in between these bookends that I want to look at today and play with a little bit. And this is what I want to bring to us today, is objects which are active, objects that are responsive, and there is a spectrum. I've put these, we can debate all the bits and pros and cons and where things should sit relative to one another. And of course, a houseplant has agency. The fish in the fish tank have agency. So this is all circular and cyclical. But just to totally simplify things, this space in the middle that we're looking at here, this is a very interesting space to me because it is not a space of technological artifacts and objects that people surround themselves with to get a task done. It is a space of objects which help contribute to someone's sense of themselves. It is a space of objects which help reflect back to us the things that we put out into the world. And designing behavior for that space, to me, is a very, very fertile ground for exploration, and it's very underexplored. There are so many there's such a drive, I think, when you start to work in this space because of the way design schools, because of the way design firms, the whole industry, and also technology and technology firms, because of the way these places have been coming together very slowly over the past 2 decades or so, maybe more. There is a strong pull as soon as you start working on a project like this to move it over to the right-hand side, to move it over to where the agency is. To say, okay, so then it'll go read my email. Okay, so then it'll wake me up at the right time, right? Then it'll do all these things. And I say we need to do all of those things, but we also need to resist that impulse. We need to think about functionality and behavior as separate things. So I do see a space where when people are thinking and considering the design of an object in industrial design, and they talk about color, they talk about materials, they talk about form, a space where they will also simultaneously and early on in the process be thinking about code and behavior and about interaction. And that this design space is all one thing regardless of what you're making. Because as we get to physical materials, as we get to materials that have their own programmability or materials that have their own ability to act in the world, we're getting to incredible new manufacturing breakthroughs, incredible new miniaturization, unbelievable software protocols, and the enabling of communication of devices that never could have had it before. But as we get to that, we need to start to shift a little bit the way we think about technology as separate or added on, or as the whole point of the objects we make. So in the same way that we can make it red or we can make it blue, we should also be thinking about what is the meaning of what it is going to express. How is it going to act, whatever it is? And the one thing I think that is very clear from the experiments I've been showing you today, and also many, 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 many other ones, is that in order for something that has its own behaviors to begin to be accepted and to begin to be valued, interacting with it needs to feel as polished and as pleasurable as interacting with a beautiful piece of millwork or a fabulous, gorgeous piece of nature, even. So it's making that and finding that exquisite marriage between the behavior and the materials. That's where I think we need to start looking and pushing. And I think there's actually a lot of space there to be explored. So I'm going to leave you just a few very high-level design guidelines that I've found useful in my work with this and that I've noticed. The first, we've talked a bit about this already. Let the function of the object prevail. It is an object. Let it do what it's going to do. Let the behavior of the person prevail. You're not coercing someone to go do something they wouldn't otherwise do. Study what they do. Look at how they intersect with a space or an object, and then see how can you enhance the union of those two things. Ask the right question. And if other people ask it of you, help them reframe this question. Rather than what will it do, ask how will it feel? Ask what will it mean? Technically, let's avoid ephemeral systems and protocols. Let's avoid some third-party communication protocol that won't work 2 years from now. Let's avoid establishing something because it's the latest and greatest and then not being able to use it again because you can't connect to the internet anymore. Any of those kinds of things. It's important to be very forward-looking if we work in this space, because these are things that should last. We're putting things into the world. We have a responsibility to make a thing that has integrity, that will stand on its own, which sometimes mean there are objects that we've created that have embedded microcontrollers in them that have been functioning for 15 years, 24/7, and never need to be updated because they're not connected to anything else. And they just do one thing and they do it well. And it's the constellation of those things that creates that beauty and the ability for that thing to be expressive. Finally, subtlety goes a long, long way. We talked earlier, Joseph Bedford, who was on this in this symposium, spoke about interest. Interest is a short-term moment. As soon as you're interested in something, you now have the possibility to be disinterested in it, he said. I love that quote. Delight is also like that. So making something that excites someone is fabulous in the right context. But nobody wants excitement all the time. So when you're talking about objects that are going to be with people, the subtlety goes a long, long way. The artist Christian Moeller, we were interviewing him for a project, and he said, the louder, the shorter, meaning if I do a sculpture and it's big and loud, people will only look at it for a very short amount of time. If it's going to be there permanently, it's got to be subtle. And I wholeheartedly agree. Subtlety goes a long, long way. Thank you. I want to continue to explore this, and I hope that I've given food for thought to contribute to today's discussions.